Before I start this video, I want to mention a company called Goat Guns. For those who don't know, Goat Guns makes these incredible models of military rifles. They are really quality pieces too, and large. They are 1/3 scale to the real thing, and measure nearly a foot long, or 28 centimeters. Much larger than I expected from the pictures when I first saw them online. The models are just that, models. The barrels are plugged and cannot be modified to fire. They are also die-cast metal, not plastic as you see a lot of other companies make. And they're pretty easy to assemble. This is the instructions that come with it. It took me about 5 minutes to assemble. No need for any glue or paint. And the M16 model doesn't require any screws either. Everything snaps together. Despite this, it is really sturdy. It's not going to bend or break under normal circumstances. The level of detail is what I think really makes these models stand out from others. This one's magazine detaches and comes with several rounds. You can pull the charging handle back and the ejection port pops open. The trigger moves. The foregrip can move around on the handguard rails. The scope as well. And I also noticed that the scope has a little lens in it which you can look through. I know I've said it before, but these models are great. I love them. Perfect for any enthusiast, either for yourself or as a gift. Check out their website. They have several other models as well. Again, that is goatguns.com. The US wants to build a space force. President Trump announced he planned to have it up and running by 2020. A space force would be the 6th branch of the US military, after the Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. While the idea of a space force at first may seem absurd, there is a need for nations to protect their assets in space, especially considering how much the world currently relies on space-based systems. The idea of space-based defenses is nothing new, and goes back to the early Cold War era. Both the Soviet Union and US launched early warning satellites. The Soviet Union placed 23mm guns on board their Almaz space stations to defend themselves, and tried to launch the Polyus spacecraft armed with a megawatt power laser. In terms of the US and a dedicated space force, the idea was first discussed as early as 1999 in a policy paper by Senator Robert Smith. Real discussion on creating a separate force began in 2017. Then in March of 2018, President Trump signed what is called the Space Policy Directive 3 to begin work on space traffic management to protect assets in space. Then in early August, Vice President Mike Pence announced the planned creation of a US Space Force by 2020. One thing I've seen people confused about is treaties regarding the militarization of space. Currently, the only treaty that would have any impact is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and maybe to a lesser extent, SALT II. Both, however, only ban the placing of nuclear weapons, along with other weapons of mass destruction, in space. It does not ban space-based weapons in general. And it's also not clear as to what classifies as a weapon of mass destruction. For example, the popular rods from God idea, in which a weapon, without a warhead, is dropped from orbit down to Earth at incredible speeds. The kinetic energy alone is enough to cause massive damage. Whether this can be considered a weapon of mass destruction or not is not clear. And if not, where is that line? It is worth noting that the Outer Space Treaty does ban weapons and military bases on celestial bodies, including the moon, asteroids, and other planets. And there may already be weapons in space we don't know about. I am by no means a conspiracy theorist, but I do think there is a possibility that either the US, Russia, or China, or even all three, already have weapons in space. Right now, the US Air Force is responsible for warfare in space. A space force would consolidate the current programs from various branches into one. The idea to create a space force is not unsimilar to the creation of the Air Force itself. During World War II, the US Army was responsible for aerial warfare. Its air service was called the US Army Air Force. With the rapid advancement in technology and growth of aerial warfare in general, the US created a separate force, which became the US Air Force. The US Space Force would be the same. As I said, the US Air Force is currently responsible for space, under a section called the Air Force Space Command. Their mission is to launch and protect satellites, and the use of those satellites. So if the Air Force already has a space command, what is the need for a new, separate space force? In the last few decades, a relatively large percentage of the communications infrastructure has moved from land into space. GPS satellites not only provide people with their locations so they can navigate, but provides data for farmers, the transportation industry, the scientific community, and many others, which all rely on GPS satellites. The same is true with telecommunications satellites. Virtually all sectors of the economy rely in some way on satellites in space. The loss of any of these systems could easily cost billions of dollars in damage, food shortages, financial system failures, and a large number of fatal accidents. Not to mention how much the US military relies on satellites for navigation, communication, intelligence, and weapons guidance. Since the creation of the Air Force Space Command in 1983, the need to protect these systems has grown exponentially, not only from the reliance on these systems, but also the increasing capability built to destroy them. Whether you are the US, China, or Russia, or any other nation, protecting these space-based systems is vital. All three of the countries have worked on, or already have weapons operational that can destroy satellites in space. The US has demonstrated this capability multiple times, with a missile called the ASM-135 ASAT for anti-satellite. The missile was fired from an F-15 and destroyed a satellite orbiting at an altitude of over 500 kilometers. In 2008, the US Navy fired a modified SM-3 missile, a weapon designed to shoot down ballistic missiles at a malfunctioning spy satellite, successfully destroying it. China successfully destroyed a satellite in 2007 with a missile called the SC-19, which is based on the DF-21 ballistic missile. Since then, they have invested heavily in the technology. They tested another system in 2013 that reached an altitude of nearly 30,000 kilometers, which is close to the altitude of geosynchronous orbit, an orbit used by many communication satellites. Russia as well has tested ASAT weapons, most notably is the PL-19 or Nadal, which has been test launched 6 times, most recently in March of 2018. And just recently, a Russian satellite that was launched in 2017 is exhibiting some strange behaviors, which the US and some European nations believe may be an anti-satellite weapon. In the face of growing threat from anti-satellite weapons, numerous methods of defending against them have been discussed, one being defensive maneuvers by the satellites, such as a slight changing of its inclination. Because of the difficulty in shooting down a satellite at such high altitudes and speeds, the interceptor needs to be positioned almost perfectly along the path of its orbit. A small change in inclination could put the interceptor out of range. Another technique the US has discussed is launching several smaller, less expensive, single-mission satellites, instead of the current larger, more expensive satellites that perform numerous missions and tasks. This would create many more targets for anti-satellite weapons to destroy. As the technology increases and the cost to get to space decreases, this is becoming more feasible. Other more encompassing measures could include things like arming satellites with defenses, such as direct energy or even kinetic weapons, and even launching satellites for the sole purpose of defending other satellites. In the 1980s, the US began research on creating a system to do just that, called the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. Part of that project called for several dozen satellites to be armed with thousands of kinetic kill vehicles to defend the US not only from ICBMs, but also other threats in space. These options, however, will not come without a massive influx of money for research, development, testing, procurement, and operations. But with a dedicated military branch for warfare in space, these projects may, one day again, see daylight. So the US Space Force isn't going to be sending up any space troops or building the USS Enterprise from Star Trek anytime soon, but if history is any indication, space will only become more and more important in the future. Over the decades, the cost to get to space has decreased drastically. SpaceX's Falcon 9 cost around $5,000 per kilogram sent to low Earth orbit for commercial customers. In the early 2000s, these costs were more than double, even triple that. In the near future, with the Falcon Heavy and reusability, that price could drop to under $1,000 per kilogram. With these lower costs, access to space is no longer limited to superpowers. Today, smaller nations and even smaller private companies operate a number of satellites in orbit, and those lower costs are being taken advantage of by the militaries of several nations, and this trend will only continue. So whether it requires a separate branch or not, warfare in space will only become more and more prevalent. Who knows, maybe there will be a ship not unlike the USS Enterprise we will see in our lifetimes.